Daily news and analysis. We keep you informed and inspired.
This is World Today.
U.S. President Donald Trump gives Iran 10 to 15 days to strike a nuclear deal, and international visitors enjoy very Chinese time in New Year's traveling and shopping across the country. Welcome to World Today, a news program with a different perspective. I'm Anna in Beijing. To listen to this episode again or to catch up on previous episodes, you can download our podcast by searching World Today. U.S. President Donald Trump says Iran has 10 to 15 days to reach a deal on its nuclear program or face serious consequences, adding that the time frame should be sufficient. Speaking at the inaugural meeting of the so-called Board of Peace on Thursday, Trump described Iran as a hot spot right now and said the outcome of ongoing nuclear talks would be decided within the next 10 days. U.S. Vice President J.D. Vance says the second round of talks between Washington and Tehran has shown some positive signs, but key U.S. red lines have yet to be met. Owen Fairclough reports.
Chairing the first meeting of his Board of Peace in Washington, D.C., Trump's tone on new but indirect talks with Iran was optimistic, but with a threat. That threat was spelled out by the White House a day earlier, recalling Trump's strike on Iran's nuclear program sites last year to support Israel in its conflict with Tehran. Both the US and Israel claim Tehran is developing nuclear weapons, but Iran's president again refuted this. Iran has asked for a 2-week pause on negotiations with the US following the latest talks on Wednesday. Tehran wants any deal to focus solely on its nuclear program, while Washington wants an end to ballistic missile development and support for regional groups such as Hezbollah.
That was Owen Fairclough reporting. For more on this, joining us on the line is Dr. Zhang Chuchu, Deputy Director of the Center for Middle Eastern Studies at Fudan University. Professor, Trump has given Tehran 10 to 15 days to reach a deal while deploying U.S. forces into the region, or bad things would happen. Washington is clearly keeping things strategically vague here. So why is that? In your opinion, is the threat a credible escalation or merely a bargaining tactic? What does Trump really want here?
Well, my observation is that Washington's strategic vagueness serves to maintain its flexibility and unpredictability. Actually, it's not the first time that Trump adopts this sort of tactic. And right now, he's trying to keep Iran off balance without prematurely committing to specific military actions. I would say from a diplomatic strategy perspective, setting a clear 10 to 15-day deadline represents both a maximum pressure tactic to inject urgency into negotiations and laying a groundwork for potential military action by establishing a predefined trigger for escalation. So currently, Trump wants a comprehensive deal that permanently curbs Iran's nuclear program, dismantles its ballistic missile arsenal, and also tries to reduce Tehran's regional influence by ending its support for its regional allies. But the problem here is that this would lead to an undermining of Tehran's power, and Tehran is well aware of that kind of objective, and that is why it is unwilling to concede easily at the moment.
Mm-hmm. Some reports even suggest a 90% chance of military action within weeks. Where is that assessment coming from? Does it mean the U.S. is already militarily prepared? And what's the worst case scenario we could be looking at?
Well, to a certain extent, this indicates that the United States military preparations are largely in place. We can see that there is a significant buildup, including 2 aircraft carrier groups, destroyers, hundreds of fighter jets, and logistics for sustained operations. And that's actually positions for potential limited strikes on its critical military targets. And I would say the worst case scenario here, implied by bad things as declared by Donald Trump, could involve a broader regional conflict, which means that Iran might retaliate via missiles, drones, and also its regional allies, targeting United States bases and also its regional allies. Also, Iran could close the Strait of Hormuz, disrupting a large percentage of global oil supplies. And also it could launch cyber attacks on infrastructure and and also there is the potential involvement of its regional allies such as Hezbollah and Houthi rebels. And all these actions could result in thousands of casualties, economic turmoil, and also instability in the region.
Professor, building on that, Iran says it doesn't want war, but is ready to hit back and even target hostile bases in the region, as you earlier mentioned. It's also holding joint naval drills with Russia. So what message is Iran trying to send? And what tools does Tehran have now to push back against the U.S. pressure?
Well, I think Tehran is signaling deterrence and resilience at the same time because it seeks to avoid initiating war, but it will also respond forcefully to aggression, which means that it's not afraid of the United States deterrence, and also it positions itself as a victim of the United States threat under international law in order to garner global sympathy and also to strengthen the government's legitimacy within Iran itself. So currently, Iran's counter options include asymmetric warfare like missile and drone strike or United States assets. And also it might try to encourage its allies such as Hezbollah and Houthi rebels to launch attacks and cyber operations. And also it might disrupt the Hormuz Strait. Meanwhile, it also tries to take diplomatic measures such as accelerating enrichment for leverage, seeking mediation through regional powers, or also rallying, anti-United States sentiment with its allies in the region. So I would say right now it's trying to take all measures to say that on the one hand, it's not afraid of the war, but on the other hand, it also tries to de-escalate the conflict.
Professor, earlier you mentioned the U.S. allies in the region. Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu says Israel is ready for any scenario and would respond forcefully if attacked. What does that mean? Could Israel act on its own beforehand? And more importantly, are Washington and Tel Aviv really on the same page when it comes to Iran?
Well, Israel's position reflects heightened deterrence. This year, for Netanyahu, it's very critical, and he's also going to face election. So right now, he emphasizes readiness for any scenario and vows an unimaginable response to attacks. And this underscores his intention of overwhelming retaliation amid fears of Iran's growing missile arsenal. So unilateral military action is a possibility here, especially given Israel's history of independent strikes on Iranian targets, like what happened last year. But I would say under Trump and also current rhetoric stresses close coordination with the United States across intelligence and operations to align efforts. So in the end, Israel still need to coordinate with the United States. Currently, I think strategic differences between the United States and Israel remain, and that include Israel's preference for maximalist goals like regime change and broader strikes, whereas the United States emphasize more on limited actions. And also Trump says that he seeks a negotiation with Iran. But in any case, I would say the two sides have shared objectives in containing Iran in the region.
Then with Trump's ultimatum on the table, how do you think other countries in the region will respond?
Well, currently, what we can see is that regional countries are reacting with caution, and they generally prioritize de-escalation to avoid economic disruption from conflict, with actions including evacuations and heightened alerts. And currently, we can see that if the conflicts escalate, and especially if it triggers fluctuation of international oil price, then the Gulf oil countries will suffer from the spillover effects. And that is why the Gulf countries like Saudi Arabia and United Arab Emirates publicly call for restraint. And also they deny the United States base use for strikes to evade retaliation. And also the other regional countries, including Oman and Qatar, also they try to offer mediation. But of course, I would say regional countries are not the main variables affecting the situation, and they do not have enough power to change Donald Trump's decision.
The ultimatum was issued during the inaugural meeting of the so-called Board of Peace. So based on the signals from that meeting, how do you assess this body and what direction might it push the Middle East toward?
Well, right. The Board of Peace is positioned by Donald Trump as a United States-led alternative to United Nations-led multilateralism. So currently, signals from the meeting indicate a role in overseeing the U.S.-aligned initiatives, potentially bypassing United Nations authority to expedite Trump-style deal-making while monitoring and critiquing the United Nations. And I think this could push the Middle East towards increased United States dominance through fragmented transaction-based diplomacy. Meanwhile, we can see that so far a lot of European states have already expressed their disagreements with this idea. And that shows that disputes between the United States and its allies in the Western world might be further intensified. In that sort of scenario, Trump might further undermine global institutions and might further alienate the other major powers when it comes to the Middle Eastern affairs.
Thanks, Professor, for those insightful analysis. That was Dr. Zhang Chuchu, Deputy Director of the Center for Middle Eastern Studies at Fudan University. Coming up, China sees cross-border travel surge during the Spring Festival holiday under visa-free policy. This is World Today. Stay with us.
Welcome. I am Chuchu Zhang, Deputy Director at the Center for Middle Eastern Studies at Fudan University. On the World Today program, we will dive beyond the headlines to uncover the stories, trends, and impacts that connect states across the globe. Join me on World Today.
Welcome back to World Today. China is witnessing a surge in cross-border travel this Spring Festival, fueled by expanded visa-free policies. The National Immigration Administration expects around 2 million border crossings per day during the holiday, an increase of more than 14% compared with last year. Among them, visitor numbers from Canada and the UK continue to climb, following the launch of a new 30-day visa-free policy that took effect on Tuesday, the first day of the Chinese New Year. Shanghai Pudong International Airport has already received its first travelers under the new scheme, as more overseas visitors come to experience the Spring Festival festivities. According to Qunar, a leading travel agency in China, the city of Datong in the northern province of Shanxi has seen inbound tourism interests jump more than 700%, making it one of the fastest growing destinations among international visitors. So for more on this, my colleague Song Ruixing had a talk with Zhang Gong, a professor from University of International Business and Economics.
Professor Gong, we are seeing a projected 14% year-on-year increase in daily border crossings, fueled by new visa-free policies for countries like the UK and Canada. Then from a business perspective, how significant are these policy changes as a lever for stimulating tourism consumptions and overall economic activity during these major holidays like Spring Festival?
Well, I've always thought that the demand from these countries to visit China is always there. But sometimes, when people go to a foreign country, you have to go through a visa process. I think it's more than about just waiving the visa application fee, which is, I think, is less than $100. It's more than that. It's not just about the money, but it's also saving the inconvenience and hassle of going through a visa application process. Think about a scenario that you're living somewhere in the middle of Canada, say in Alberta, for example, in a place where there is no Chinese embassy or consulate. And then you have to go through the process of, maybe sending the materials to a consulate in Vancouver, for example, and go through that process. It's going to take a couple of days. You have to fill some forms. All of these things to potential tourists are entry barriers, right? So I think by waiving this process, it makes things grossly convenient and easier. People just feel like going tomorrow, they can just go tomorrow, right? So I think this eliminating the entry barrier greatly stimulates demand. I think makes things a lot easier for a lot of people. Right now, China has become a quite attractive place to visit and also quite economical place to visit. I mean, look at the price levels here in China compared to many parts of the world. It's extremely competitive. So I think this is a great policy, and the end results right now seems to be delivering what this policy is intended to do.
Then it looks like the numbers are striking, like inbound arrivals are, shall we say, peaking, and platforms like China are reporting over a 700% surge in interest for destinations like Datong, which is in Shanxi province. Then what does this tell us about the shifting landscape of China's inbound tourism market?
Well, I won't characterize it as peaking. We're just at the early stage of a big surge. It's just tip of the iceberg. I think the demand will continue to grow. There'll be more tourists coming to China. To be honest, I've been to quite a few airports here in China, and compare the traffic volume at these airports for the last couple of months with, say, airports at, say, Dubai, Doha, for example, Hong Kong, for example. I don't see we're anywhere close to peaking yet. In those places, there's a lot of traffic. And I would expect that airports like in Beijing and Shanghai, in Shenzhen, Guangzhou, would be exactly the same. So I think I would imagine that the traffic is going to continue to grow. And again, as I said, China is still very much an attractive place to visit. I think especially now the international narrative about China has totally changed. I've seen a lot of comments online about China after the CMG's Spring Festival Gala is broadcast to the entire world, especially related to things related to these robots, right? So everywhere in the world, people are talking about China is living in the future of mankind. And they want to have a taste of that. They want to take a look at it. People inevitably want to see something that's ahead of the time. What's happening here in China, in terms of the infrastructure, in terms of the environment, for example, in terms of the food, in terms of the great sceneries. So I think China is becoming very attractive to the international tourists.
Which sectors stand to benefit the most from this influx of international visitors?
Well, I think obviously, things related to traveling, right? I mean, lodging, for example, airline, railway industry, theme parks, for example, dining, whining, all these things tend to benefit from the influx of international visitors. And I think especially in those first-tier cities, these are the windows to the world from China, like Shanghai, like Beijing, and touristy places like Xi'an and Guilin, for example. These are places typically international visitors would go, and their local economies would definitely benefit from this influx of traffic from industrialized countries, and these people are going to spend some money here in China.
Yeah, we see more international travelers are experiencing those Spring Festival celebrations. Then how might their spending patterns differ from those of domestic tourists? Do you think there's a difference?
That I'm not very sure, but I would imagine that people coming to a foreign country are ready to spend a bit of more money, right? I would imagine that the people can afford coming to China would be happy to stay in 4-star above hotels. They might be spending a little bit more. But also, I don't want to underestimate the purchasing power of domestic tourists. Chinese tourists are also spending a lot of money these days. So I think they might spend more, they might spend less, but whatever. I mean, as long as they're spending some money here in China, that's good for China's economy.
But beyond the headline growth figures, how sustainable is this surge?
I think it's going to be sustainable. I think, the world is very large with, 60 billion people, I guess, right? So there will be always tourists coming to China, 100 million, 200 million coming every year. I think it's also quite true that the tourists are not just coming from the industrialized world, but also from emerging markets as well. Russia, for example, has many, many visitors coming to China. This is something I know, because Russians typically have a tradition of taking an extended vacation in the summertime. Usually, no matter your financial situation is, because I was told that if you don't take a vacation during the summertime, which can be detected by the skin of your color, usually you're tanned a little bit, you will be sort of looked upon in Russia. So the Russians definitely go abroad during the summer, and there are many places they can go these days. A lot of them actually come to China, to Hainan Island. So people from the emerging markets also visiting China as well. Some countries like Malaysia, for example, Turkey, and even countries like Thailand. I mean, people coming to China as well, and Vietnam, people coming to China as well.
Okay, so can we understand the surge as not just a primarily holiday-driven, but we are witnessing a more durable reopening cycle for inbound tourism?
I think it's more than just tourism. I mean, they want to see I would make an analogy. I mean, it's like in the 1980s, people like to go to New York City, right? I mean, this is the center of the world at those times. In 19th century, everybody goes to Paris. It's the same thing. I think in this new century, Beijing and Shanghai are the centers of the world, in terms of technology development, in terms of cultural development, in terms of the latest things going on, the cool things going on. So I would imagine that it should be sustainable in the long run.
And then that brings us to the infrastructure in China. Like major international airports like Shanghai, Pudong are already reporting heavy traffic and welcoming the first arrivals under the new 30-day policy. Professor Gong, how well prepared is China's travel infrastructure to handle and capitalize on this sustained growth in inbound tourism?
Well, China's infrastructure is next to none. I mean, it's definitely be able to handle the increased traffic. The Pudong Airport, Shanghai's Hongqiao Airport, Beijing's Daxing Airport can easily, let's take an example of Daxing Airport in Beijing. I would say it can easily handle a traffic doubling the size of today's traffic, easily. And so with more international visitors coming to Beijing, definitely we can handle that. We can increase flight numbers. The airport can accommodate the traffic. Let alone the railway, the famous high-speed railway system infrastructure definitely can handle the traffic. I think international tourists and visitors would be amazed at China's high-speed bullet train. It's the world-class infrastructure.
And looking beyond this holiday surge, what are the long-term business implications?
In terms of long-term business implications, I think on the one hand, it contributes to the local economy, and also somehow this is also essentially exports of services, right? International visitors coming to China and spend money here is from economics point of view, from a trade economics point of view. This is essentially an export of services. We're actually getting foreign exchange from the expenditures of these people. So I think it contributes grossly to China's economy. And I think there's also an aspect of people-to-people exchange here. Well, I mean, this is not just business implications. This is political implications. With more people coming to China, more people knowing about China, certainly it contributes to a better understanding of China. And, in general, that will contribute to a better relationship between the two countries. So I think definitely we would welcome foreign visitors and tourists coming to China to see for themselves what's really happening here and compare what they witnessing themselves to what's portrayed in their media. Especially, for people coming from the United States, from Europe, I think they can make their own judgment, make their own comparison, what's really happening versus what's being portrayed and pervaded to them via their media. I think there's quite a big gap here. The more people knowing about this gap, the more people understanding this gap, the better for the two countries, the relationship.
That was Zhang Gong, professor from University of International Business and Economics, speaking with Song Ruixing. This is World Today. We'll be back after a short break. Welcome back to World Today, our Chinese New Year edition. The world seems to be experiencing a split. While Europe and the US work to bring inflation down, China is grappling with a different problem: persistently weak prices. What's going on? Why do low prices worry Beijing? And how are policymakers aiming for a reasonable rebound? My colleague Tu Yuan is joined by Professor Liu Baocheng, the director of the Center for International Business Ethics, University of International Business and Economics, Dr. Sean Chan, associate professor of practice in finance, the University of Hong Kong, and Professor Doc Guthrie, the director of China Initiatives at the Thunderbird School of Global Management, for a close look.
As much of the world is trying to push prices down, as we mentioned, authorities in China are working to lift them. Seems a tale of two very different worlds. So in simple terms, how would you interpret this contrast from an American perspective?
I have a long history as an economics scholar and a China scholar. And so I think about all of these things in the context of what has happened in the United States economy and the global economy over the last 45 years or 40 years, as I've been a scholar growing up. I think one of the most interesting things that has happened in the United States we often don't focus on, but we blame corporations and China for stealing our jobs and kind of driving prices down because of cheap labor. But we actually did this in the United States. We did this in 1980 under Milton Friedman and Ronald Reagan. China didn't steal our jobs. We invited corporations to go global so that they could find cheaper labor and basically create value by taking jobs away from the working and middle class and then transferring those values up to the upper 5% of the US economy. The thing that's so interesting, and this is where my research is all driven in, is that China used that process over the last 45 years to build the most sophisticated manufacturing supply chain in the world. And that manufacturing supply chain is unrivaled. There is nobody, so the tariff war or whatever we want to talk about, there's nobody who's going to be rivaling Chinese manufacturing supply chain in the next 40 years. And so, the idea of driving prices down or up, like all of these tariff war issues are about the circumstantial aspects of how to do this. But the real issues are how do you build the most sophisticated manufacturing supply chain in the world? And that's what China has done over the last 40 years. And so that's my position.
But what about this time? China's focused on low prices. Isn't that different from the rest of the world? Isn't that kind of, to some people, quite strange?
Well, I think that, if you think about low or high prices, you think about markets, right? And so, yes, it is true that China is focused on low prices, but there's market supply and demand. And, supply is driven in part by capturing the largest number of customers, and lower prices are better for that. And so I think it's a really interesting take that China is positioning itself in that is really, really distinguished from the US economy of high-end white-collar economies versus the manufacturing economies that can produce prices at lower levels. And so I think China's going to win this game. China's going to win.
All right. So Sean, you're in Hong Kong.
Yes.
Is Hong Kong experiencing what the mainland is experiencing? Your explanation here, please.
Yes. I think what Dr. Guthrie mentioned pointed out quite correctly that this has been one of the competitiveness of China. And over the past decade, China has already built not just functional, but very efficient production chain. And that helps prices can able to come down and also can deliver high quality products at the same time. What's the pricing have to do, for example, as you're referring to Hong Kong, and that also trigger some adjustment in Hong Kong economy that in order to stay of its competitiveness, it's not just a major financial hub around the globe, but it also have to take advantage of these prices from the mainland and help to build a stronger foundations of the economies here in Hong Kong. I expect that, lifting prices versus what China, I think, from the economic standpoint, trying to avoid is the any deflationary spiral, no matter is in which particular sector. But this is something that, from the risk management point of view, China policymakers would definitely have to prevent. So the topics today, I think, is very relevant with what those challenges around the world. While the West is trying to cool any overheating, China is starting to kick off of a more new high-tech advanced economy. So I think that can leverage with any price adjustment and inflation.
Right. Today we're focusing on the actually macroeconomic policy of the Chinese authorities in the coming year, which is trying to lift the prices up. So it's quite different from the rest of the world. So, Bao Chen, from a Chinese perspective or the mainland's perspective, compared with other parts of the world, especially Europe and the United States, why do you think China's policy priorities diverge so sharply, even as they face the same global uncertainties? What are the key differences, like inflation dynamics or demand conditions and monetary environments in China?
Well, simply put it, for the formation of the market, there are three key stakeholders: the workers, investors, and the consumers. So it seems that our workers are working too hard and too diligently.
Right.
That can really drive the price down for competition. And then the investors are getting worried, be it a government investor or corporate investor. They need more money to expand their business. And consumers are getting more and more cautious. So they are unwilling to open large of their pocket to purchase more, and for good reasons, on individual level. So now the government policymakers sees that if the consumption remains lackluster, then that can really squeeze investment and even to push the economy into a static cycle. So that is why when they compare the figure, the globally inflation rate is roughly 4.2%. China's inflation is almost zero. If you compare the nominal GDP versus the real GDP, they are equal. And so policymakers think it's not really a good sign. So therefore, they are pushing over that for the sake of expanding the investment. But I do not think policymakers will take it as really as end goal, but as a mean to send more dynamics into the economy by spurring investment either into the stock exchange or directly to push forward for production expansion. So this is the deliberation, but as how much they are talking about moderately or reasonably raise the price, but how much can be set as a benchmark? Is that going to be 3% that was really considered over the last 5-year plan, or 2%? So that's something that is not really decided, as for me as a part of the government think tank, and we are still debating on that. And how much we can really leave it to the market and how much the government can really do artificially to push the price a little forward. So that's something important. But more fundamentally is that behind the symptom of the lower prices, what can be done more fundamentally to deal with the tax reform, to deal with the differentiated competition rather than head-on competition, repetitive competition between businesses. So these are really the core issues that we need to deal with. And I think more practically is that how we can really build a unified and streamlined market rule so that the cost of doing business for companies can be substantially reduced is something that's more significant rather than simply push consumers to buy more or to pay more.
All right, we'll dive deeper into what can be done, what should be done later on in the show. But if I remember correctly, consumer price inflation actually accelerated to a nearly 3-year high in December, right, Bao Chen? Even though 4-year inflation fell to a 16-year low. So you're saying the speed of prices picking up is not sufficient. How urgent do you think this policy task is?
It's not really very much urgent. It's more of a structural tactics that a government has to deal with. It seems that investors, both government and companies, are really envious of the savings rate for the households. So now, over the past 5 years, China's savings rate stubbornly stay at roughly 43%. So that's something far higher than the OECD countries, which is average of a little more than 10%. So they see the money, but the money is sleeping over there. And how can really stimulate this money to really to go to the economy so that businesses can be further expanded? So that's something investors are looking for. But in the meanwhile, it also gave them a very tough task that you got to be able to convince consumers that instead of simply to buy more of your products, what are those benefits that the consumers are seeking. And structurally speaking, consumers need more high-end services, medical care, better schooling, and particularly for senior care. But that's not really being satisfied. But on the other hand, if you look at clothes, electronics, etc., they're flooding the market. And now even e-vehicles are really seeing a rapid decline on the consumption side because there is a saturation point and there are over 100 EV companies are competing with each other. So there's no way that they're going to be able to raise their price because it's more of a homogeneous competition. So now it is really up to the government policymakers to focus on multiple functions instead of simply say, hey, consumers, you got to spend more. You got to buy 10 sets of TVs at home. So that's not really the approach. They need really to educate and also adjust the micro policies because right now there's not really much to deal with on the interest rates. So it is already low enough. It's really there, how to look at structurally on the demand side, and then to push up for branding, for differentiated competition, and more importantly, to provide high-end services that are acutely needed by the consumption side.
To Doug, I think that the fragmented market issue mentioned by Baocheng is a very interesting one. I believe you also face it, or the same problem in the States. It's not like between or among provinces, it's between states. So from your perspective, do you have any solutions for that issue?
Yeah, so it's a great question, and I love this conversation. But just to be clear on this, from my position, it's not an issue of the fragmented marketing or the fragmented market. It's an issue of the movement of labor. Okay, so where China is in such a powerful position is that it has a mobile labor force. So in addition to the people that are employed all over China, there's something called the migrant labor force that is about 360 million people, which is the size of the entire US population, that moves around the country and is able to service the manufacturing economy in spikes of production, but not be full-time employees of the firms that need them for the 1 or 2 months that are spikes of production. Now, the Chinese government did attempt to deal with this in 2015. And the laws were changed under the floating population law. But basically, local officials are able to deal with this however they want, right? And so if you have Foxconn in Zhengzhou, or if you have TSMC wherever they are, or you have Lens, they are all players that are able to service their production employees at spikes of production in ways that China allows for the most productive labor force that is a movement of labor. And by the way, we know about Foxconn going to Chennai. This will never happen in India, right? This is just not going to happen in India, and it will never happen in the United States. And so China has actually, I think, really kind of done this interesting dance of dealing with migrant labor and dealing with different places of labor across. But those places, those individuals who are the 360 million people of the migrant labor force, they're careful with their money. They save. They are not consumers because they know that they have to be thoughtful about how they do this. So when you ask the question about the difference between China and the United States, like, yes, they are all sort of provincial versus state level labor forces, but the United States is, it's a global union labor force. We are never going to be in a situation that's competitive with China in terms of how it's developing this. Now, whether or not China is going to change this, I don't know. And so that's really an interesting question. But it is, I think it's a key question of like how productive China's manufacturing supply chain is, the sophistication of the manufacturing supply chain, the use of temporary labor versus vocational technical labor versus engineering labor. It's a much more sophisticated manufacturing supply chain in terms of the labor force and in terms of what they produce than the United States by far at this point. And so the United States, just it being a fragmented thing versus provinces versus states, the United States can't compete. We can't compete with China.
Okay. So to Sean, in promoting price recovery, how much room does monetary policy really have? I think Baocheng already mentioned that there is almost no room for interest cuts. What's your opinion there? Do we, have to do what Japan did, like lower it to like zero or even negative interest rate? Or
Yes, I think Professor Liu and Professor Guthrie has already identified very correctly that now, because of the strong productivities and the efficiency in China, these price pressures has taken into account of the demand side, which household has to save more because of the savings on some of their investments in the property sector. And because of these competitiveness pushing down prices, what we have seen for the past 5-10 years, the government is trying to deleverage and trying to take off the off-balance sheets financing, but at the same time lower the interest rates and try to save more for these, not just the state-owned enterprises, but private enterprises, and encouraging them for investment. I think monetary side is just one side of things. I think the governments have lots of ammunition, in particular from the fiscal policy side of could drive the economies to go further. And what the governments have done for the past few decades on infrastructures, but those require longer payoff period, and that might not be ideal for this cycle. Lower taxes, could be another policies that policymaker could done more. While, for example, the U.S. is trying to mimic the lower tax economies like the Singapore or other Southeast Asian economies with a competitive tax rate, China could make reference of that and how to make, for example, corporate tax system, the income tax system, more in line to be more competitive. Another thing that China could think of if borrowing from other major economies is that on rebates. For example, China on these technologies and seeking for example, foreign investment, tax rebate could be another thing that attract more fund flows and investments into China, and that will help. So not just from the monetary point of view, I share your ideal thinkings that lowering interest rates could help. But sometimes if we are focusing on inflation, focusing on price adjustment, then probably the fiscal side could have done better.
So you're saying the government's decision to increase its deficit is a right decision?
Well, China has lots of buffers, by looking at the current account, by looking at the capital account. China, if well planned ahead, I think China could make some space in their fiscal policies, and just some deficit policies or infrastructures could help.
All right, then. It seems like you all are, I can say, cautiously optimistic, right? So let's look into where such rebound can materialize, or most likely to materialize, and where will it be hardest to achieve? We know that the government has made, sustained efforts to stabilize the property market, yet results remain limited. So does this suggest in some sectors, markets actually do not always respond predictably to policy support as expected? And which sectors do you think can respond as the government wishes? Maybe we start with Sean.
Right. How are we going to do it if, from the Keynesian perspective, if China wants to have inflation and close to the levels that simultaneously stabilizing the output gap, keep real interest rate supportive? And I think at the moment, maybe there could slight adjustment on the interest rates. There's still some room on that. And from the financial stability angle, I think nominal growth high enough, it could ease the real debt burden. So stronger nominal wage and income growth could support consumptions, as our colleagues referring to. So improve corporate earnings can be another way. How corporates can really adjust some pricing power in their industrial sectors and to improve margins, and that can translate into savings, into consumption as well. So stabilizing any situations financially from the corporate point of view, I think now should be paying lots of attention, because I believe that, corporate spending, CapEx, higher improvements in their earnings, and that can translate into the consumption, the demand side, and that could support the price to adjust into a more reasonable level.
Bao-Cheng, which sectors do you think are most likely to materialize this
I think
target?
Actually the government has already identified the high-end service would be a breakthrough in boosting consumption. For example, in the technical training for people, because right now it's not really the mobility that really matters most, but it's really the quality of workers, because when we are really heading into new productive forces, and the most dynamic factor would be people. So how people can be better trained to upgrade their skill sets to deal with the creative work and to deal with even managing the robots, managing the dark houses without people working on assembly lines, and the entertainment industry, etc. They all need more creativity than simply raw labor with their sweats. But for that, we need a more assuring policy because, for example, we used to have a very strong market for the extracurricular training program for school kids. And then it seems that the policymakers, particularly during the COVID period, they stamped out such sort of an industry. So we need better regulations so as to revive those high-end services. And the other is that we need to push more for research and development in the meanwhile to be synchronized with the branding process. I compared, as a marketing professor, the earning power of Chinese brand versus OECD brands. Our earning capacity is 10 to 12% lower than the OECD countries in terms of the firms as a price-making power. So therefore, simply rely on conventional goods, dealing with utility instead of creativity, of course, there's going to be jammed competition. So differentiated competition lies in that how companies can really shape their perceptual value with their brands, of course, supported by quality. So this is something that we need to go along with a high-quality development campaign proposed by the government. And then more fundamentally, as a professor, we also need more educational reform because right now, given all the AI in place, if we continue to cram students with basic terminologies to create the more of a homogeneous type of skill sets among those students, because China, every year we generate more than 10 million graduates, and they are not really fitted for the new requirements in those career tracks. So these are really the fundamental issues. And also more sectorially, you see that people are really lined up. You need to wait for 3 hours, even if you book a doctor in the hospital. So you still have to wait. So there is also acute demand. The consumers are willing to spend the money, but the supply side is insufficient. So therefore, structural reform to address those sectors, areas that are not really there to be sufficient, so the money can be directed over there. So this year we are going to continue to issue long-term bonds to stimulate the production expansion. The other issue is to address the investment environment. So if we compare the growth rate of different provinces within China, so why Guangdong, Zhejiang, and Jiangsu stand out to be the top biggest contributors? Because they have more private companies than state-owned ones. So therefore, to alleviate the private sector, to provide better job opportunity, to provide better and healthier competition, so this is something that we need to do. Instead of, government tell, okay, let's set the price floor, so this is going to further distort the market and create more of the problem than really alleviate such sort of issue.
All right. Then last question, let's zoom out to a global perspective. There is also concern that looser monetary conditions and rising prices in China could spill over into global inflation. So how worried should the rest of the world be, and how valid is such concern? Shall we begin with Baocheng this time?
Yes, by basic economics, the price inflation at home can really have a flooding effect over the global marketplace by boosting export. Already that we are facing a very tough situation. The Europeans are really having a higher scrutiny over the dumping issues. But what we can do is that China has already joined the reallocation of production cycle. For example, actually, the reason that we remain very strong in our export drive lies in several factors. One is that, as Professor Doug has mentioned, that we have such a strong and competitive production capacity. So therefore, more of those global souths are really receiving not only the exports of finished goods, but they also face the export of or reallocation of the entire assembly lines over there to boost their industrialization process. So there is still a big market for it, together with very practical technology transfer. And The other is that if we really shape more of our branding, because right now, if you notice over the interbrand ranking, only Huawei is within the top of the 100 top global brands, but no other companies can really enter into that ranking. Although we have well over 100 Fortune 500 biggest companies, so most of the Chinese companies are big enough and they are massive, but in terms of the brand equity, they are not there yet to compete with the top-notch global players. So this is something that we can really move forward. The other is that China has filed enormous amount of the patents globally, but how to really translate those patents into real competitiveness by providing more of the savvy gadgets to have more of the price-making capacity. So this is something we can do to alleviate the concern over China flooding global market with dumping.
Right. I think Baocheng is a perfectionist, right? Okay. To Sean, please.
Right. I think modest price rebound in China is not going to be a global inflationary shock. I think, if anything, it normalized China's role in the global pricing system. And the rest of the world, I think, should be more concerned about whether weak demand than about China causing any new inflationary wave. So I think for global investors, any successions on reflate pricing or to adjust that will support, especially in the emerging market on the asset risk premium, and also would stabilize any volatility in the foreign exchange market. And Hong Kong as a role in the financial hub, and that would be supportive of that.
That were Professor Liu Baocheng, the director of the Center for International Business Ethics, University of International Business and Economics, and Dr. Sean Chan, Associate Professor of Practice in Finance, the University of Hong Kong, and Professor Doug Guthrie, the Director of China Initiatives at the Thunderbird School of Global Management, speaking with our Tu Yun. That's all the time for this edition of World Today. Thank you so much for listening. Bye for now.